Deputy Speaker, I know the member for Ochil and Perthshire is pleased to follow, knows that people who voted for Brexit did so for a number of reasons. Some wanted and expected, were promised more money, £350 million a week, and now we face a debt of something like £50 billion. Some voted because they thought they'd still have their jobs because we'd have access to the single market, and now we know we won't get unfettered access. And some, very fundamentally, voted for Brexit because they thought we would take back control, we would have enhancement of our parliamentary democracy, and we would have enhancement and supremacy of our courts. But this bill makes that parliamentary democracy and that enhancement of our courts in fact, the opposite of what people expected. Because what has been referred to as Henry VIII's powers, which of course are new powers given to ministers to actually change legislation as they deem appropriate without consultation, without reference to Parliament, means that there will be fundamental changes without MPs having a look in at all. And what's more, this legislation is drafted so broadly that it does not allow the courts to effectively use their right of judicial appeal to actually limit and constrain government. And thirdly, of course, there aren't enforcement mechanisms to enforce the rights and protections we currently enjoy from Europe. So in practice, Mr Deputy Speaker, the sort of things this may influence are firstly workers' rights. For instance, the Workers' Agency Directive was poo-pooed by the government, and under the Beechcroft report they did, is likely to be ruled out. Secondly, in terms of the environment, where 80% of the law is decided, we've got a situation with the Clean Air Direct, the Air Quality Directive, which means that the government is currently in court under EU legislation, facing possible fines if they don't fulfil those obligations. Well, a minister under this bill, under clause 17, can simply say, well, those EU regulations are inappropriate, so we'll get rid of them. And as for human rights, the fundamental charter isn't assured. Any of our rights can be just crossed out by ministers. In terms of consumer rights, my honourable friend mentioned REACH, of course, which is the directive which requires all chemical companies to prove a chemical is safe before marketing it. The minister could cross that out and introduce the American system, which instead requires an agency to prove a chemical is hazardous. And that is why asbestos is still legal in the United States, and it may be so here. So, far from enhancing Parliament, we're open to having our rights and protections stripped away. Now, the aim of the bill was supposed to be to cut and paste and transfer rights and protections and laws, and nobody's arguing that that shouldn't happen. The question is, can this occur without this massive so-called power grab, without Henry VIII's power? And what I would suggest is it can. But it needs 4 changes, and I hope the Minister is listening for a moment. It needs a number of changes to achieve this transfer without those draconian powers. And those changes are, firstly, to ensure and enshrine in the bill the current rights and protections enshrined in EU law will continue. Secondly, to have enforcement mechanisms in place for those rights which will be taken away when the EU institutions are taken away. Thirdly, to state in the bill that the bill is not intended to impact on human rights, and to ensure in any case where any of our rights and protections are challenged, they are referred to a select committee process. Obviously, we'll vet out most of the stuff will be technical, but when there's a challenge to the basic rights and protections, something akin to a turbocharged European Scrutiny Committee, and I'm hoping the Secretary of State is listening to this, where the European Scrutiny Committee can, of course, refer for debate anything going through EU legislation at the moment. That right should be enhanced so it can be referred, amended and voted upon here. Because fundamentally, Mr Speaker, we're talking about British values. The Prime Minister talks about British values, and there's no more fundamental British values than parliamentary democracy and the right of law. the rule of law, and those are both under threat unnecessarily. If this bill goes through as it's currently drafted, it will be a Trojan horse for Brexiters to just come in well armed to get rid of parliamentary democracy as we know it and the rule of law. That's why they need to be disarmed. There's no justification for the way this bill is currently drafted. It should be taken back in its entirety. It can be brought back in October to cut and paste with those particular safeguards. And what's more, my own view, as other members will know, is that as people had voted in good faith for Brexit for a number of reasons that now have not materialised, they should have the right to have the final say on the exit package, to judge whether the exit package actually stacks up against their reasonable expectations. That's what democracy is about. This is about the destruction of democracy, and I'll be voting against this bill wholeheartedly tonight.